The bedroom door closed softly, and Emily felt James's hands trembling as much as her own. At 22 years old, with her heart pounding so hard it seemed to echo through the walls of the luxury apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, she was about to give something she had guarded so carefully, not out of moralism, but from fear of never finding someone who made her feel safe enough. And there he was, 15 years older, with deep brown eyes that seemed to read her every thought, whispering against her lips, "I've got you." In that moment, surrounded by the scent of lavender that permeated the Egyptian cotton sheets, she didn't know that promise would be tested in ways neither of them could imagine. Sometimes the most transcendent decisions of our lives are made in an instant, but their consequences last forever. The modern lighting cast dancing shadows on walls decorated with contemporary American art. Emily watched how the light played with the contours of James's face, the expression lines around his eyes that spoke of years lived, the firm jawline that in this moment softened with tenderness, the lips that had spoken words resonating in her soul like cathedral bells. He slid his hands across her face with a delicacy that contrasted with the evident strength in his fingers. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a murmur loaded with genuine concern. "We can wait. There's no rush." But Emily knew there was. Not a physical rush, but an emotional one. The urgent need to prove to him, to prove to herself that she was capable of trusting completely, of being vulnerable, of crossing that invisible threshold, separating loneliness from true encounter with another human being. "I'm sure," she responded, and in saying it something inside her broke free. A tension she'd carried since 16, since her parents' death in that accident on the Long Island Expressway, since Aunt Margaret had become her guardian, with that perpetually worried expression that said without words, "The world is dangerous, especially for pretty girls without family to protect them." Minutes converted into hours suspended in time. James was careful to the point of reverence, murmuring words in English that sounded like ancient poetry. "Beautiful, my love, my darling," while the light from the street lamps on Fifth Avenue filtered through silk curtains, creating a golden glow that made everything seem like a dream. When it finally ended, when he held her afterward, she cried, not from sadness or regret, but from a relief so profound it pierced her like a ray of sun after a storm. She had waited for this moment, for this person, and it was infinitely more than she had imagined. "Did I hurt you?" asked James, brushing the brown hair from her face with trembling fingers, his voice tinged with concern. "No," she whispered, looking into his eyes. "You made me feel whole." He closed his eyes, and she saw a tear slide down his cheek. This adult man, successful, confident in all aspects of his life except this one, love. And in that instant, Emily understood that she wasn't the only one who had been guarding her heart, waiting for the right moment, the right person. Outside, New York City slept and woke simultaneously, as only that city knows how. The distant sounds of motorcycles in the early morning, the murmur of late conversations in bars that never closed, the clinking of wine glasses and laughter rising from the street. All of it seemed to form part of an urban symphony celebrating her decision. True love is not the absence of fear, but the courage to surrender despite it. It had all begun 3 months earlier, on a rainy afternoon in October, when the leaves in Central Park were turning amber and crimson, and Manhattan was dressed in that pearl grey that made even the oldest buildings seem nostalgic. Emily was finishing her shift in the perfume section of Saks Fifth Avenue, tired after 8 hours attending demanding customers who tried dozens of fragrances without buying anything. She wore her simple black uniform, hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and thought only of getting to her small apartment in Brooklyn, taking off the shoes pinching her feet, and soaking in the bathtub with salts she'd bought with her employee discount. She wasn't thinking about destiny. She wasn't thinking about love. She certainly wasn't thinking her life was about to change completely. The marble stairs were wet. Someone had entered with a dripping umbrella and hadn't cleaned up. Emily took the first step, the second, and on the third, her foot slipped. Her heart rose to her throat. Her arms flailed, seeking something to grab onto, and the world tilted at an impossible angle. Then arms caught her, strong, secure, enveloping. "Careful," said a masculine voice, deep and warm like aged cognac. Emily looked up and found herself staring at the most extraordinary face she'd ever seen. Not extraordinary in the conventional sense. He wasn't a magazine model or a movie star, but extraordinary in the way some ancient works of art are extraordinary, full of character, of lived history, of depth that cannot be faked. James had dark hair with silver threads at the temples, tanned skin that spoke of summers on the coast, and those eyes, God, those brown eyes that looked at her with a mixture of concern and something else, something she couldn't identify in that moment, but would later recognize as recognition, as if his soul had been searching for hers. "Are you okay?" he asked, and only then did Emily realize she was still clinging to his arms, that her hands rested on his chest, that she could feel the beating of his heart through the cotton shirt and Italian-tailored suit that probably cost more than 6 months of her salary. Yes, thank you," she stammered, suddenly conscious of her wrinkled uniform, her faded makeup, how she must smell after a day spraying perfumes on customers. But he didn't release her immediately. He held her a second longer than necessary, his large, warm hands on her waist, as if wanting to make sure she was really stable. "These stairs are dangerous when it rains. They should put up warning signs." "Yes, they should," she agreed, finally taking a step back, feeling the cold of the air where the warmth of his contact had been. He kept looking at her, and an expression she couldn't decipher appeared on his face. "Do you work here?" "In perfume," she responded, pointing vaguely toward the section she'd just left. "Finished your shift?" "Yes." "Then," he said, with a smile that completely transformed his face, making him look years younger, "let me buy you a coffee." As compensation for the scare, Emily should have said no. Every survival instinct Aunt Margaret had instilled in her screamed to say no. Rich men don't invite perfume countergirls for coffee without ulterior motives. It was an unwritten but universally understood rule, but there was something in his eyes, a deep sadness he tried to hide behind courtesy, a loneliness she recognized because she saw it every morning in her own mirror. "Okay," she said before she could convince herself otherwise. The smile he gave her made the risk worthwhile. The small cafe he took her to was 2 blocks from the store, a place she'd passed hundreds of times without really seeing. From the outside it seemed ordinary, but inside was like entering another time. Exposed brick walls, black and white photographs of old New York, the aroma of freshly ground coffee mixing with the smell of old wood, and the soft sound of jazz playing in the background. They sat at a table by the window, where they could see rain hitting the glass and pedestrians running with umbrellas. James ordered 2 lattes and some croissants that arrived warm, still steaming. "I'm James," he said, extending his hand formally. "Emily," she responded, shaking it, feeling the firmness of his grip and the warmth that seemed to radiate from him. "Emily," he repeated, as if savoring her name. "Beautiful name." She blushed, a habit she hated but couldn't control. "Thank you." For the next hour, an hour that became 2, then 3, they talked, or rather, he talked, and she listened, fascinated. James told her about his historic building restoration company, about how he'd spent years learning ancient construction techniques, about his passion for preserving traditional New York architecture in an era of relentless modernization. "Why old buildings?" Emily asked, genuinely curious. He looked out the window and his expression became distant. "Because old things have value. Because not everything should be replaced with something new and shiny. Sometimes what already exists just needs to be restored, cared for, appreciated for what it is." There was something in the way he said it, an underlying sadness, that made Emily suspect he wasn't just talking about buildings. "And you?" he asked, turning to her with complete attention. "What does Emily do when she's not saving people from buying wrong perfumes?" She laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised her. "I'm studying accounting at NYU. Or trying to, between 2 jobs. 2 jobs? Perfume counter during the day, and at night I tutor high school students in math. That's impressive," he said, and in his tone was real admiration, not condescension. "It's necessary," she replied simply. "Dreams don't finance themselves." "And what's your dream?" No one had asked her that before. Not Aunt Margaret, who thought dreaming was a waste of time. Not her co-workers, who measured success in discounts obtained and boyfriends conquered. No one. "To have my own accounting firm," said Emily, feeling a mixture of embarrassment and pride. "Small, specialized in helping small businesses and people who need someone who understands their circumstances, not just their numbers. James looked at her with an intensity that made her feel naked, completely seen. "You'll do it," he said, with a certainty that made her shiver. "I can see it." Encounters that change lives rarely announce themselves with fanfare. They arrive disguised as everyday accidents. James returned the next day, and the next, and the next. At first, Emily thought it was coincidence. New York was huge, but certain neighborhoods were like small towns. It wasn't so strange to run into someone repeatedly. But when he appeared for the 5th consecutive time, waiting for her exactly when her shift ended, with that slightly nervous smile that made the lines around his eyes deepen, she knew it wasn't coincidence. "Are you stalking me?" she asked, half joking, half serious. He laughed, a deep laugh that made his chest vibrate. "Probably. Should I worry you'll call the police?" "Depends," she responded, crossing her arms but unable to contain a smile. "What are your intentions?" James's smile faded, replaced by a seriousness that completely disarmed her. "To know you, to see you smile, to discover if this connection I feel is real or a product of my lonely imagination." The brutal honesty of his words hit her like a wave. No one had spoken to her like this before. No games, no pretenses, just naked and vulnerable truth. "Then I won't call the police," she said softly. "Not yet." Thus began a courtship that defied all conventions Emily knew. James didn't behave like the guys her age she'd met at university, guys who measured romance in vague text messages and last-minute plans for cheap beers. He was deliberate, attentive, traditional in a way that at first disconcerted her and then enchanted her. He took her to dinner at restaurants where waiters greeted him by name, where the menu had sophisticated dishes, where each plate was a work of art presented with reverence due to good food. He taught her to appreciate California wine that tasted of dark cherries and oak, the perfectly grilled steak that melted on the tongue, the creamy risottos that the special chef prepared only for favorite customers. But what really won her heart weren't the expensive restaurants or sophisticated wines. It was the stolen moments in his car, a silver BMW that smelled of leather and his cologne, something woody and fresh that she now associated uniquely with him. They'd parked near Central Park at sunset, when the sky turned orange and purple, and New York stretched before them like a mosaic of lights and shadows. There, without the weight of his world or the limitations of hers, they'd talk for hours. He told her about his divorce, a painful process that had lasted 2 years, and left him questioning everything he believed he knew about love and commitment. His ex-wife, Christina, had been his young love, but over the years they'd become strangers who shared a house, a bed, a bank account, but not their lives. "What happened?" Emily asked one night, when stars began to appear over the city. James was silent for a long moment, looking at his hands on the steering wheel. "We lost each other. She wanted a social life I couldn't give, constant parties, endless trips, a husband who was a decorative accessory instead of a partner. And I wanted intimacy, deep conversations, someone who really saw me, not just what my bank account could provide." "That must have been painful," she said softly. "It was. Still is sometimes. Especially when I see how it affected Sarah. Sarah, his daughter." James spoke of her with fierce love mixed with palpable guilt. She was 25, worked as an architect in Boston, and according to him, barely spoke to him since the divorce. She blamed James for the separation, for breaking up the family, for not trying hard enough. "And you?" he asked, turning to look at her. "What about your family?" Emily swallowed, feeling the familiar knot in her throat that always appeared when she spoke of her parents. "They died when I was 16. Car accident on the Long Island Expressway. A trucker fell asleep at the wheel and crossed into oncoming traffic." James's hand found hers, intertwining their fingers with a firmness that said, "I'm here. You're not alone. I went to live with Aunt Margaret. She did the best she could, I suppose, gave me a roof, food, the strict rules she thought I needed. But love—" She stopped, searching for the right words. Love was something assumed, not expressed. Like paying bills, necessary but not something you talked about. That must have been lonely. "It was," she admitted, surprised by how easy it was to talk to him, by how words flowed without the weight of judgment. "Still is sometimes. That's why I take refuge in numbers. Numbers don't disappoint you. 2 + 2 is always 4. There's comfort in that certainty." James squeezed her hand. "People can also offer certainty, if you give them the chance. She looked at him, this man who had burst into her life like a chance accident on wet stairs, and wondered if he was that certainty she'd been looking for without knowing it. True love arrives when we least expect it, dressed in the clothes of the ordinary. The first significant obstacle came in the most unexpected way, not from outside, but from within the relationship itself. They'd been together 2 months when Emily discovered the bank account. It was an accident, or so she told herself afterward. James had left his briefcase open on the sofa while making coffee in his apartment kitchen, and an envelope had fallen to the floor. Picking it up, she saw her name, Emily Rose Carter, printed in elegant letters on a bank statement from Chase Bank. With trembling hands, she opened it, and her world tilted. $50,000. Deposited in an account in her name. An account she'd never opened, knew nothing about, that existed as a silent secret between her and a man who said he loved her, but apparently didn't trust her enough to consult her about something like this. When James returned with 2 coffee cups, he found Emily standing holding the statement with an expression he couldn't interpret. Anger, confusion, pain. "I can explain," he said quickly, setting the cups on the coffee table. "Please," she responded, her voice dangerously calm. "Explain to me why you opened an account in my name without telling me. Explain to me why you put $50,000 in it. Explain to me what the hell you were thinking." James ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she'd learned to recognize. "I wanted to make sure you'd be protected." Protected? From what? From everything. From me. From something happening to me. From... He stopped, searching for words. "From things going wrong and you being left with nothing." With nothing? Emily's voice rose in volume, years of accumulated frustration finally finding an outlet. "James, I have a job. 2, actually. I have savings. Small, yes, but they're mine. Earned with my effort. Why do you assume I need your money? That's not it. Then what is it? Is it because I'm younger? Because I earn less than you? Because you think I'm with you for your money, and want to make sure that if I leave, at least it was worth it?" The blow of her words made him physically recoil. "God, no. Emily, I never thought that." "Then what?" she demanded, tears starting to roll down her cheeks. "Why didn't you consult me? Why didn't you ask if I wanted your money, your protection, your charity?" The last word fell between them like a stone in a pond, creating ripples that expanded and touched everything. James sat heavily on the sofa, suddenly looking all of his 37 years and more. "I'm afraid," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "Afraid of losing you. Afraid you'll realize you could have something better. Afraid that one day you'll wake up and see an older man who's using his money to keep a young woman because it's the only thing he knows how to offer." The silence that followed was dense, loaded with truths neither had verbalized before. Emily sat beside him, still holding the bank statement like evidence of... what? Of his love, of his fear, of his need to control the uncontrollable? "James," she said softly, forcing him to look at her, "I'm not with you for your money. I'm with you because when you look at me I feel seen, because your conversations challenge me, because your laugh makes my heart skip a beat. Because when you hold me I feel like I've finally found home." "Then why do I feel like I'm not enough?" he asked, and in his voice was a pain so raw it broke her. "Because you were hurt, because your ex-wife made you feel you were only valuable for what you could materially provide. But I'm not her." Emily took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "And I need you to trust that. I need you to trust me." "Trust us?" James closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "I don't know how to do that without trying to control everything." "Then learn," she said firmly, "because I can't be in a relationship where I'm treated like something fragile that needs to be protected instead of an equal partner." He nodded slowly, and in that gesture was the promise to try, to change, to be better. "I'll close the account. Or better yet, we'll put it in both our names and we'll decide together what to do with that money. Or," said Emily with a small smile, "you could donate it to an organization that helps young orphans pay for their education. Turn your need to protect me into something that really helps others." The look James gave her was pure astonishment. "You're extraordinary, you know that?" "I know," she joked, and the tension finally broke. That night, lying in his bed, With the lights of New York flickering outside and the distant sound of nighttime traffic, they established new rules. Complete transparency, decisions made together, respect for each other's autonomy, and, above all, brutal honesty even when it hurt. Relationships don't strengthen in easy moments, but in how we navigate the turbulent waters of conflict and misunderstanding. Aunt Margaret's appearance was like a hurricane no one had foreseen. It was a Sunday morning, one of those lazy November days when Manhattan dawned wrapped in fog, and New Yorkers allowed themselves to stay in bed late. Emily and James were enjoying a quiet breakfast, fresh bagels with cream cheese he'd bought from the corner deli, newspapers spread across the table, the sound of the radio playing soft jazz in the background. Then the doorbell rang. Insistent. Aggressive. James got up to answer, expecting perhaps a package or a neighbor with some complaint about noise. What he found at the threshold was a woman in her 60s, with grey hair severely pulled back in a bun, dressed completely in black as if in mourning, with an expression that could freeze the Hudson River in midsummer. "Is Emily here?" she demanded, without introducing herself, without courtesy, without acknowledging she was invading a private space. "Who's asking?" James responded with forced politeness. "Her aunt, Margaret Carter, and I need to speak with her, now." Emily appeared behind James, her face losing all colour upon seeing Margaret. "Aunt, what are you doing here?" "What am I doing here?" Margaret's voice rose an octave. "The question is, what are you doing here in this man's apartment on a Sunday morning dressed like that?" Emily looked down, suddenly conscious she was wearing only one of James's t-shirts that reached mid-thigh and nothing else. She blushed to the roots of her hair. "Mum," James intervened with a calm he didn't feel, "perhaps we should continue this conversation inside where there's privacy." Margaret evaluated him with a look that stripped him of everything, his expensive clothes, his luxury apartment, his evident age, and found it all deficient. "I don't need privacy to tell my niece she's making a monumental mistake." "Aunt, please," Emily begged, mortified. But Margaret was in her element, years of resentment and worry flowing like an overflowing river. "How old are you, 35, 40? 37, James responded with dignity. 37, 15 years older than her. "And what do you want from my niece? A young thing to brighten your midlife crisis? Someone young and pretty to hang on your arm at your business dinners? With all due respect, ma'am, you don't know me." "I know men like you," Margaret spat. "Men who see young, vulnerable girls and think they can take advantage of their inexperience, their need for affection, their economic situation." "Enough!" Emily's shout cut through the air like a knife. "Aunt, enough! You don't have the right to come here and judge my life. I have every right. I raised you. I gave you everything." "You gave me a roof and food," Emily interrupted, her voice trembling but firm, "and I'm grateful for that. But you never gave me what I really needed. Acceptance, unconditional love, the freedom to make my own decisions, even if they're mistakes." Margaret blinked, as if she'd been slapped. "Everything I did was to protect you." "No, Aunt. Everything you did was project your own fears onto me. Because a man hurt you once, you assumed all men would hurt. Because your parents disapproved of your choices, you assumed you should control mine." The silence that fell was absolute. You could hear the ticking of the antique clock on the wall, the distant hum of the refrigerator, the accelerated beating of 3 hearts. "Mrs. Carter," James finally said, his voice soft but firm, "I understand your concern. If I had a niece, a daughter, I'd be worried too. But let me assure you that my intentions toward Emily are completely honorable. I love her. And if she'll let me, I plan to spend the rest of my life showing that love every day." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, and Emily could see the conflict on her face, the desire to protect fighting against the realization that perhaps, just perhaps, she'd misjudged the situation. "Have lunch with me," James said unexpectedly. "Tomorrow, at the restaurant of your choice. Let me show you who I really am, not who you assume I am." It was a bold offer, potentially disastrous. But in James's eyes was a determination Emily recognized, the same determination he applied to restoring old buildings, the patience to rebuild brick by brick until the structure stood firm again. Margaret looked at Emily, who nodded imperceptibly. "All right," she finally said. "Tomorrow, 2 o'clock, at the Smith." After Margaret left, Emily collapsed on the sofa, covering her face with her hands. "I'm so sorry. I don't know how she knew I was here." "It doesn't matter," James said, sitting beside her and pulling her to his chest. "What matters is you're shaking, and I need to know what I can do to make you stop." "Just hold me," she whispered, "and don't let go." "Never," he promised, and in that moment he meant it. Monday's lunch was a surreal experience. The Smith, known for its American comfort food and diverse clientele, provided a neutral setting, public enough to maintain civility, private enough for honest conversations. James arrived punctual, dressed impeccably but without ostentation. He brought flowers for Margaret, a bouquet of white roses, symbol of respect and new beginnings. The gesture caught her off guard, and Emily saw how her aunt's defenses loosened slightly. For 3 hours, while consuming dish after dish of sophisticated American food, James opened up in ways that surprised even Emily. He spoke about his childhood in a small town in upstate New York, son of a carpenter and a teacher, how he'd worked in construction from age 15 to pay for his architecture studies, how he'd built his company from scratch with bank loans and sleepless nights. "Wealth didn't fall from the sky for me," he explained, holding Margaret's gaze. "I earned it. And I know what it's like to struggle, to worry about money, to work 2 jobs. I know what it feels like that the world is designed to keep you down." He spoke about his divorce with brutal honesty, how he'd failed in his marriage, not because he didn't love Christina, but because they wanted fundamentally different things from life, and neither had been brave enough to admit it until it was too late. "I'm not looking for Emily to fill a void," he said with a firm voice. "I don't need her to feel young or relevant. I love her because she's intelligent, determined, kind in a world that punishes kindness, because she challenges me to be better, because when I'm with her, I don't feel alone for the first time in years." Margaret listened, her expression impenetrable but her eyes attentive. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. "And what happens when she realizes she could have someone her age, someone who shares her life stage?" "Then she'll break my heart," James responded simply, "and I'll have to accept it. But I'm not going to sabotage this relationship by assuming the worst. I'm not going to treat her like she's incapable of making her own decisions." For the first time, Margaret smiled, a small smile, almost imperceptible. "But there, you're smarter than I thought." "Or more foolish," James joked. Love makes you vulnerable in unexpected ways. When they said goodbye, Margaret hugged Emily, a real hug, not the mechanical gesture of always, and whispered, "If he makes you unhappy, I'll kill him. But he has good eyes, honest eyes." It was as close to a blessing as she was going to get. The people who love us most are often the ones who hurt us most with their excessive protection, because the fear of losing us clouds their judgment. Life has a cruel way of interrupting just when things begin to stabilize. 3 weeks had passed since lunch with Aunt Margaret. Things between Emily and James had reached a comfortable rhythm. He'd learned to consult her before making decisions that affected her. She'd learned to accept his care without feeling she was losing her independence. They loved each other with an intensity that surprised them both, and talked about the future with a confidence that seemed justified. Then Emily woke one morning with nausea so violent she barely made it to the bathroom in time. At first she attributed it to something she'd eaten, the sushi from last night's restaurant perhaps, or seafood that was questionable. But when the nausea continued day after day, when her breasts began to hurt and her period was 2 weeks late, a terrifying possibility began to form in her mind. She couldn't be pregnant. They'd used protection, always, except that once, the first time, when they'd been careless in the urgency and emotion of the moment. But that had been only once. Once. Once is all it takes to change the course of a life. She bought 3 different pregnancy tests from 3 different pharmacies, as if diversification could change the result. She took them all in the bathroom of her small Brooklyn apartment, while Aunt Margaret was at church, each revealing the same 2 unmistakable pink lines. Positive, positive, positive. She sat on the cold bathroom floor, hugging her knees, while her mind raced at 1,000 miles an hour. She was 22 years old, still in college, 2 jobs that barely covered her basic needs, and now growing inside her, a life completely dependent on decisions she didn't even know how to make. Panic hit her in waves. What would James think? Would he accuse her of trapping him? Would he think she'd planned this? What if he didn't want the baby? What if he... Her phone vibrated. A message from James. "Dinner tonight? I miss your face." Her face that was covered in tears. Her face that reflected pure terror. 3 days passed before she found the courage to tell him. 3 days of morning sickness that lasted all day, of breasts so sensitive that wearing a bra was agony, of fatigue so deep she could sleep 16 hours and wake exhausted. Finally, she invited him to her apartment. Neutral, safe, a place where she could fall apart if necessary, without the weight of his luxurious space. He arrived with flowers, as always. White lilies that smelled of spring promises. He kissed her, and for a moment she allowed herself to get lost in the familiarity of his lips, the comfort of his arms. "I need to tell you something," she finally said, pulling away. James's smile faded. "You're scaring me. I'm pregnant." The words fell between them like bombs, each syllable a small explosion that altered the landscape of their reality. James remained completely still. His face went through a series of expressions so fast Emily could barely follow them. Surprise, shock, disbelief, and then, "Joy? Are you sure?" he finally asked, his voice strangled. 3 tests, and all the classic signs. "God," he whispered, running his hand through his hair. "God!" The silence stretched, and with each passing second, Emily's heart sank deeper. This was a mistake. She should have waited. She should have. Then James dropped to his knees before her, taking her hands. "May I?" he asked, pointing to her still flat stomach. She nodded, unable to speak. He placed his hands on her abdomen with a reverence that made her cry. "Hi," he whispered to the baby that was little more than a handful of dividing cells. "I'm your dad, and your mum is the bravest woman I know." Emily sobbed, and suddenly he was standing, holding her so tight she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek. "I thought you'd be furious," she said against his chest. "Furious?" He pulled back to look at her, his face showing genuine confusion. "Emily, why would I be furious? Because it wasn't planned. Because it'll ruin all your plans. Because I'm too young and not ready and— Hey, look at me," he interrupted, framing her face with his hands. "This is unexpected, yes. Scary? Absolutely. Complicated? Without a doubt. But a mistake never. This baby is ours. And we're going to give them all the love 2 people can give." "Are you sure?" she whispered, needing to hear it again. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." That night, lying in her small bed that barely fit 2 people, they made plans. She'd move into his apartment, not because he insisted, but because it made sense with the baby coming and his apartment being much more spacious. She'd continue her studies as long as she could. He'd reorganize his work schedule to be more present. "We'll do this together," James said, his hand resting protectively on her belly. Every step of the way, together. And for the first time since she'd seen those 2 pink lines, Emily believed that maybe, just maybe, everything would be okay. Life's best gifts often come wrapped in the paper of fear and uncertainty. The move to James's apartment was easier than expected, mainly because Emily had very few possessions. A suitcase of clothes, a box of textbooks, her basic beauty products, and the framed photograph of her parents that had been on her bedside table since she was 16. That was all she had to show for 22 years of life. "Is that all?" James asked, looking at the few boxes in his cavernous living room. "Mobility has its advantages," she joked, but there was sadness in her voice. The truth was she'd never been able to afford to accumulate things, neither physically nor emotionally. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hand instinctively finding her belly where the baby was growing, still invisible to the world. "We're going to fill this place with memories," he promised. Good memories. The first days were an adjustment, learning where he kept the mugs, discovering he was meticulously organized in ways she hadn't anticipated, negotiating closet space and bathroom schedules. But there was a sweetness to domesticity, to waking together every morning, to sharing coffee while reading the newspaper, to cooking together in the evenings. Then the letter arrived. James found it first in the building's mailbox. A thick cream-colored envelope with expensive paper, addressed to him with elegant handwriting that Emily didn't recognize, but that made the color disappear from his face. "What is it?" she asked, watching him stare at the envelope without opening it. "It's from Sarah," he finally said, his voice tense. Sarah, his daughter, who lived in Boston and with whom he barely spoke, who didn't know about Emily, about the baby, about any of the seismic changes in her father's life. With slightly trembling hands, James opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a formal invitation. Dad, I'm getting married in 3 months. I've tried to call you, but you never answer. Maybe because you know what I'm going to say. That I want you there, but that I find it hard to forgive you for destroying our family. However, you're my father. And despite everything, I love you. So this is your invitation. Boston, August 15th. I hope you come. Alone. Sarah. The alone at the end was underlined twice. Emily felt as if cold water had been poured over her. She doesn't know about me, she said, not a question. I haven't told her, James admitted, guilt written in every line of his face. Every time I tried to talk to her, we ended up arguing. I thought it would be easier to tell her in person, but it was never the right time, Emily finished for him. I have to go, James said, and in his voice was resignation mixed with determination. And I have to tell her. About you, about the baby, about everything. She'll hate me, Emily said softly, not with self-pity, but a simple statement of fact. Probably, James agreed with brutal honesty, at least at first. But she needs to know, she needs to meet you, because you're going to be part of this family, and our child will be her half-sibling, and we can't build a life based on secrets. They decided to go to Boston together 2 weeks before the wedding, giving Sarah enough time to process the news before the big day. It was the right decision, but that didn't make it less terrifying. The flight from New York to Boston took an hour that felt like a minute. Emily spent the whole time looking out the window, the clouds passing, the coastline appearing below, the world moving while she remained suspended in a state of anticipatory anxiety. What if she completely rejects me? She asked when Boston Harbor began to appear on the horizon. Then we'll work on it, James responded, squeezing her hand. For as long as it takes. They'd agreed to meet at a restaurant near the waterfront, a neutral place with the sound of the Atlantic as soundtrack. Sarah arrived punctual, a tall, elegant woman with her father's dark hair and green eyes she must have inherited from her mother. She wore an impeccable business suit and carried an expression that could cut glass. "Dad," she said by way of greeting, kissing his cheek with mechanical coldness. Then her eyes landed on Emily. "And you are?" "Sarah, this is Emily," James began, but Sarah interrupted him. "Your girlfriend." "Yours?" Her eyes evaluated Emily from top to bottom, noting her youth, her simple clothes, the way she clung to James's hand like a lifeline. "Oh my God, Dad. Really? Sarah, if you could sit down." "How old are you?" Sarah demanded, completely ignoring her father. 20, 21? 22, Emily responded, forcing herself to maintain eye contact despite the hostile intensity of Sarah's gaze. 22. 3 years younger than me. My father is dating someone 3 years younger than me. Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "This is even more pathetic than I imagined." "Sarah, that's enough," James said in a hard voice. "Enough? I'm barely getting started. You know what, Dad, I thought you couldn't sink lower after what you did to Mom, but this," she pointed at Emily with contempt, "this is a new level." Emily felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give Sarah that satisfaction. "Your father and I love each other," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I know it's hard to understand, especially given the circumstances, but love," Sarah practically spat the word. "Please, you're nothing more than a convenient distraction for his midlife crisis, a pretty little doll who makes him feel young again. And when he gets tired of you, and he will, you'll be discarded like all the others." "There haven't been others," James intervened, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Emily is the first person I've been with since your mother." "Oh, how special you must feel," Sarah said to Emily with poisonous sarcasm, "the lucky winner of Daddy's divorce prize." "I'm pregnant," Emily blurted out, the words escaping before she could stop them. The silence that fell was absolute. Even the restaurant noise seemed to have faded, leaving them in a bubble of shock and revelation. Sarah looked between her father and Emily, her expression moving from contempt to horror to something that might have been pain. "Of course you are," she finally said, her voice hollow. "Of course, because why just ruin your life when you can completely destroy everything?" "Sarah," James began, but she was already standing, grabbing her purse. "I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear excuses or explanations or how this is different. Just don't come to my wedding. Clearly you have your own family now. Sarah, please. Goodbye, Dad. And she left, leaving them sitting at a table with 3 place settings and 2 broken hearts. Emily allowed herself to cry then, silent sobs that shook her shoulders, while James held her in the middle of the restaurant, not caring who was watching. "I'm so sorry," she whispered against his chest. "I ruined everything." "No," he said fiercely, lifting her chin to look at him. "You didn't ruin anything. Sarah is hurt and she's lashing out, but that's her choice, not your fault." But as they traveled back to New York that night, they both knew something fundamental had changed. The conflict was no longer just between them and the outside world. Now it had infiltrated the very foundations of their expanding family. The wounds of the past bleed into the present, and healing them requires more than time. It requires courage to face painful truths. The following months were a roller coaster of emotions that left them both exhausted. Emily's pregnancy progressed, her belly rounding visibly, bringing not only the anticipated joy of new life, but also symptoms no one had warned would be so brutal. Morning sickness, which should have disappeared after the first trimester, persisted into the 4th month. She vomited several times a day, lost weight instead of gaining it, and the simple act of smelling cooking food sent her running to the bathroom. James was terrified. He hired private doctors, scheduled extra consultations, obsessively researched every symptom on the internet at 3 in the morning. His need to control, to fix, to protect, resurfaced with a vengeance. "You need to eat," he'd insist, presenting her with plates of bland food she looked at with barely contained revulsion. "I can't," she'd respond for the 1000th time, pushing the plate away. "The baby needs nutrients." "I know. You think I don't know. But my body isn't cooperating, James. It's not something I can control." Arguments became frequent, small sparks of frustration that exploded into debates about who was being more reasonable, who was being more difficult. Both were exhausted, both scared, both feeling inadequate for the task ahead. To make matters worse, Emily had to leave both jobs. The nausea made it impossible to stand for hours, and her body needed rest she couldn't afford to take while working. For the first time in her adult life, she was completely dependent on someone else, financially, emotionally, practically. The loss of independence gnawed at her, creating a resentment she didn't want to feel but couldn't avoid. "I hate this," she said one night, lying on the sofa with a cold cloth on her forehead. "I hate being useless." "You're not useless," James responded automatically, but she could hear the fatigue in his voice. He was reaching his limit too. "I'm a burden. Admit it." "I'm not going to admit something that isn't true." "Then what am I?" "Your charity project, another broken building that needs to be restored." The words cut deep, and she knew it by the way he physically recoiled. "That's unfair," he said quietly. "This whole situation is unfair," she responded, tears rolling down her cheeks. "Unfair to you, to me, to this baby who hasn't even been born and is already causing problems." "Don't say that." "Why not? It's true. If I weren't pregnant, Sarah might talk to you. If I weren't pregnant, I wouldn't be this pathetic thing that can't even keep food down. If I weren't pregnant—" "You'd be less you," James interrupted, sitting beside her and taking her hand. "And I'd be less me. This baby isn't a problem, Emily, it's our consequence, and the consequences of loving are never mistakes." She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe him. The 7th month brought new terrors. During a routine checkup at Mount Sinai Hospital, doctors noticed something on her ultrasound, an anomaly in the uterine walls that could indicate premature birth. She needed complete bed rest, they said. No stress, no physical activity, just rest. James transformed the apartment into something resembling a hospital wing. He hired a nurse to be on standby during the day. He bought a fetal monitor they could use at home. He installed alarms and emergency systems. He moved his office to the living room so he could be close at all times. "This is too much," Emily protested weakly, but without real conviction. She was scared, more scared than she'd been in her life. "Nothing is too much when it comes to you and our baby," he responded, and in his voice was a desperation that scared her as much as her own condition. The nights were the worst. Lying in darkness, feeling the baby move inside her, Emily found herself making deals with God, with the universe, with any force that might be listening. "Let him live," she'd silently beg. "Take me if necessary. but let him live. One night, James found her crying silently, tears rolling onto the pillow. "Pain?" he asked immediately, reaching for the phone to call the doctor. "No," she whispered. "Just fear. So much fear." He lay beside her, careful not to press against her swollen belly, and held her as gently as he could. "Me too," he admitted. "I'm terrified." It was the first time he'd admitted it aloud, and somehow sharing the fear made it more manageable. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked. "Then we'll deal with it. Together. Like everything else. What if I'm not strong enough?" James pulled back enough to look into her eyes, even in the dimness. "Emily, you've been strong enough since the moment I met you. Since before, even. You lost your parents and kept going. You worked 2 jobs and studied. You chose me despite all the obstacles. You chose our baby when you could have taken an easier path. Your strength isn't in question. Then why do I feel so weak? Because strength isn't the absence of fear. It's continuing despite it. And that's exactly what you're doing. The darkest moments reveal not our weakness, but our capacity for resilience, the ability to keep going when every fiber of our being wants to give up. The 8th month brought a crisis neither had anticipated. Emily had been complaining of extreme fatigue, beyond normal pregnancy tiredness. She'd fall asleep mid-conversation, be breathless after walking from bedroom to kitchen, with a dull pain in her chest she attributed to the baby's pressure against her ribs. Then, one afternoon, while napping on the sofa, James noticed something alarming. Her lips had a bluish tint and her breathing was shallow and irregular. The race to the hospital was a blur of panic. Sirens, red lights. James's hands gripping hers while he murmured prayers he didn't know he remembered from his Catholic childhood. In the emergency room, a team of cardiologists examined her while James waited outside, each minute an eternity. The diagnosis, when it finally came, was devastating in its simplicity. Undiagnosed congenital heart defect. The mitral valve had a minor malformation that had never caused symptoms severe enough to be detected. But pregnancy, with increased blood volume and stress on the cardiovascular system, had aggravated it to a critical point. "We need to operate," said the cardiologist, a man in his 50s with tired eyes that had seen too many emergencies. "But there are complications due to the pregnancy." "What kind of complications?" James asked, his voice barely controlled. "If we operate now, the stress of surgery will likely induce labor. The baby is 32 weeks, viable, but premature. There would be risks. And if we wait? Then we risk complete cardiac collapse. Emily might not survive until delivery." The world tilted. James had to sit down, his vision blurring at the edges. "There's a third option," the doctor continued. "Induce labor now at 32 weeks and then immediately perform cardiac surgery. It maximizes survival chances for both, but what? The stress of giving birth immediately followed by major surgery. It's a lot for an already compromised body. There are no guarantees." When they let James see Emily, she was awake, with supplemental oxygen through a nasal cannula, monitors beeping around her like mechanical fireflies. "I'm going to die," she said without preamble, her voice surprisingly calm. "No," he responded fiercely, taking her hand. "You're not. I won't let you." A sad smile touched her lips. "I don't think you have a say in this. Emily, listen to me," she interrupted, squeezing his hand with surprising strength. "If they have to choose, you choose the baby. You understand? The baby. I'm not having this conversation. James, please, I need to know you'll be okay. That our baby will be okay. Both of you will be okay," he insisted, tears flowing freely down his face now. "Because we're going to do what the doctor said. Induce labor, then surgery. And you're going to fight, Emily, for me, for our baby, for all the years we still have ahead." "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know. Me too." He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers. "But you're the bravest person I know. And if anyone can do this, it's you." They spent that night in the hospital, James sleeping in an uncomfortable chair beside her bed, waking every time a monitor beeped or she moved. In waking moments, they talked about small things and big things. Names for the baby, how to decorate the nursery, books they wanted to read, places they wanted to visit. They built a future with words because it was the only thing they could control. "If I don't survive," Emily began at one point, but he put a finger over her lips. "No, James, we have to be realistic. The reality is, I love you. The reality is, you're going to survive this. And the reality is, I'll be there when you wake up holding our baby, waiting for you to open your eyes and start lecturing me about something. She laughed weakly, the sound half sob. I love you so much it hurts. Then survive, he pleaded. Survive and let me love you for the rest of our lives. Surgery was scheduled for 6 in the morning. At 5, Emily signed a dozen consent forms, each one a reminder of everything that could go wrong. At 5:30, she was wheeled away on a gurney with James walking beside her until he was no longer allowed to go further. At the threshold of the operating room, she looked at him one last time. You promised to take care of me, she said, repeating the words he'd said that first night so long ago. And I will, he responded. Forever. Then the doors closed, and all he could do was wait. There are moments in life where the only thing we can do is trust in doctors, in fate, in the love we've built, and hope it's enough. The 8 hours that followed were the longest of James's life. The waiting room at Mount Sinai Hospital was painted in institutional shades of green and white, with plastic chairs that dug into your back and a coffee machine that dispensed lukewarm liquid that vaguely resembled coffee. James sat there, surrounded by other people waiting for verdicts from operating rooms, wives waiting for husbands, parents waiting for children, children waiting for parents, each lost in their own private purgatory of uncertainty. He'd tried calling Sarah 3 times. Each time it went straight to voicemail. He left messages, first calm, then desperate, finally pleading. Your half-brother is about to be born. Emily might die. I know you're angry, but please, Sarah, please. Silence. Aunt Margaret arrived in the 2nd hour, dressed completely in black as if already in mourning. She sat beside him without a word, her rosary moving between her fingers as she whispered prayers in Latin she'd learned in her youth. I should have protected her better, James finally said, breaking the silence. Margaret stopped praying. You can't protect people from fate. I should have insisted on more checkups, better doctors. I should have... Should, Margaret interrupted, her voice tired. Shoulds don't change what is, only what might have been. At the 4th hour, a different doctor came out, obstetrician, not cardiologist, with an expression James couldn't read. Mr. Morrison, you have a son. 5 pounds, 6 ounces, small but a fighter. He's in the NICU, but his vitals are strong. Joy and terror collided in his chest. And Emily? Still in surgery. The delivery went well, but the stress on her heart, they're working on it. They're working on it. 4 words that said nothing and everything simultaneously. The doctor led him to the NICU, a room filled with plastic incubators, each containing a small miracle, each surrounded by parents with sunken eyes and fragile hopes. And there, in incubator number 7, was his son, small, incredibly small, with tubes and wires connected to his tiny body, monitors tracking every heartbeat, every breath, but alive, undeniably, miraculously alive. A nurse explained the rules. He could touch the baby through the incubator portholes, but couldn't hold him yet. He needed to remain in a controlled environment until his weight and temperature stabilized. James slid his hand through the porthole, allowing his son's tiny fist to close around his index finger. The grip was surprisingly strong, as if this small being was already determined to hold on to life. Hi, little one, he whispered, tears rolling down his face, uninhibited. I'm your dad. Your mum is fighting right now. She's fighting for us, and you need to meet her because she's everything. The baby yawned, a movement so small he almost missed it, and something inside James broke and remade itself simultaneously. Promise me something, he continued, speaking as much to the baby as to the universe. Promise me you'll stay, because she's going to survive this, and when she does, she needs to see your face. She needs to hold you. She needs to know that everything, the pain, the fear, every terrible moment was worth it. He spent 2 hours there simply watching his son breathe, each inhalation and exhalation a small miracle. Then a different doctor arrived. This was the cardiologist, still wearing surgical scrubs and exhaustion written in every line of his face. James's heart stopped beating. The surgery was successful, the doctor said, and James had to grip the side of the incubator to stay standing. We repaired the valve and her heart is responding well, but Mr. Morrison, there's always a but. The stress of surgery combined with childbirth put her in an induced coma. We need to give her body time to heal, to stabilize. It could be days, it could be weeks. But she'll wake up? I can't promise anything. The next 72 hours are critical. And so began a new form of waiting. Not in a sterile waiting room, but between two rooms. NICU to see his son. ICU to sit beside Emily, who lay motionless between white sheets, a breathing tube in her throat, monitors tracking bodily functions he'd never thought to question before. He brought photos of the baby, holding them before her closed face. Look, Emily, look how beautiful he is. He has your nose, your eyes, I think, though I can't be sure yet, but definitely your fighting spirit. He talked non-stop, about the baby, about how he was breathing on his own now, about how he'd gripped his finger with surprising strength, about the plans they'd made and still hoped to fulfill. He talked because silence was unbearable, because as long as he talked, he could pretend she was listening. On the third day, Sarah appeared. James was sitting beside Emily's bed, holding her cold hand, when he heard footsteps at the threshold. He looked up, and there she was, his daughter, dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, eyes red from crying. "Dad," she said, and her voice broke. He stood up and she crossed the distance, throwing herself into his arms with the same desperation she'd had when she was a child, and he was her hero. "I'm sorry," she sobbed against his chest. "I'm so sorry. I was so cruel, and now she might die. And I never had the chance to really know her, to tell her that—" "Shh," he soothed, stroking her back. "It's okay. You're here now. Can I see him? My brother." The word, brother, made James's heart expand painfully. He took her to the NICU where the baby slept, oblivious to the drama surrounding him. Sarah stood staring at the incubator, tears rolling silently. "He's so small," she whispered. "He is, but strong, like his mother. Tell me about her," Sarah suddenly said, turning to look at him. "Tell me about Emily. The real Emily, not the version I invented in my head." So James talked. He told about the meeting on the stairs, about the coffee that turned into dinners, about how Emily challenged and softened him simultaneously. He talked about her determination, her kindness, her way of seeing beauty in small things. He talked about the love, real, complicated, imperfect, they'd built. And Sarah listened, really listened for the first time. "I want her to wake up," she finally said. "I want to meet her. I want to apologize for being such a bitch." "Then talk to her," James suggested. "Doctors say coma patients can sometimes hear." Back in the ICU, Sarah sat on the other side of Emily's bed, awkward but sincere. "Hi, Emily. I'm Sarah, the horrible daughter who treated you terribly. I don't know what to say except I'm sorry, and please don't die, because my dad needs you, my brother needs you, and I think I need you too." There was no response. The monitors continued their constant beeping, but perhaps, just perhaps, Emily's fingers moved almost imperceptibly. Hope is the cruelest and most beautiful of feelings. It keeps us holding on when logic says to let go. Emily dreamed. In her dreams, she was back in the small town where she was born, walking through cobblestone streets she knew, but that had changed in ways she couldn't identify. Her parents were there, young and smiling, as she remembered from photographs. Her mother hugged her, smelling of jasmine and freshly baked bread. "Not yet," her mother said softly. "It's not your time yet." "But I'm so tired," Emily responded, and she was tired to her bones. "I know, my love, but there's someone waiting for you. Two someones, actually, and they need you to be brave a little longer." The dream faded, replaced by another, this one of a baby crying, the sound tearing at her, making her want to reach even when her arms wouldn't move. Then slowly sensations emerged, pain mainly, a deep throbbing pain in her chest, the taste of plastic in her mouth, the sound of beeping and humming, voices distant and blurred. She opened her eyes. The world was too bright, too blurry. She blinked, trying to focus. Slowly a face materialized, James, but not the James she knew. This James had sunken eyes, several days' beard, worry lines carved so deeply they seemed permanent. "Emily," he breathed, and in his voice was such relief it hurt to hear. "God, Emily." She tried to speak, but there was something in her throat. Panic. "It's okay, it's okay," he said quickly, pressing the call button for the nurse. "It's a breathing tube. They're going to take it out now that you're awake." The next few minutes were an uncomfortable blur of doctors and nurses, the tube being removed, as uncomfortable as she'd feared, her scratchy throat and hoarse voice trying to form words. "The baby," she finally managed to croak. "Where's my baby?" The smile that lit James's face was like sunrise. "He's perfect. In the NICU, but perfect. Do you want to see him?" "Yes, please." But doctors insisted on checkups first. Blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen levels. They asked questions she answered mechanically. "Do you know where you are? What year is it? What's your name?" Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they brought a wheelchair. James helped her transfer from the bed. Her body felt strange, disconnected, as if it belonged to someone else, and wheeled her through corridors that smelled of disinfectant and hope. The NICU was a place of soft light and muted sound, and there in incubator number 7 was he, her son, her baby. Tears came then, unstoppable and inevitable. James opened the incubator portholes, and with trembling hands, Emily touched her son for the first time. Small, so incredibly small she feared breaking him. But when her fingers brushed his cheek, he turned his head toward her, instinctively seeking. "Hi, my love," she whispered, her voice broken with emotion. "I'm your mom. I'm sorry I took so long to meet you." A nurse approached, smiling. "Would you like to hold him? He's been waiting for his mum." With expert care, the nurse lifted the baby from the incubator, temporarily disconnecting monitors, and placed him in Emily's arms. His weight, so light but so substantial, anchored her to reality in a way nothing else had. This was her son, hers and James's, the result of love and fear and courage, and all the complicated and beautiful things that make up a life. "Does he have a name?" she asked, looking at James. "I was waiting for you," he responded, kneeling beside the wheelchair. "I couldn't name him without you." Emily looked at the baby, whose tiny hands clung to her finger, whose eyes, definitely her eyes, stared at her with alarming fixation for someone so young. "Ethan," she said softly. "Ethan, like my father." "And Robert, like yours." "Ethan Robert Morrison," James pronounced, testing the name. "It's perfect." They spent an hour there, simply holding Ethan, memorizing every feature, the tiny toes, the miniature eyelashes, the way his mouth moved even when he slept, as if rehearsing to cry. "I thought I'd lost you," James finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "The doctors said there were chances, but I couldn't imagine a world without you in it." "You didn't lose me," she responded, resting her head against him. "I promised to stay, remember, and I keep my promises. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." At the NICU door, Emily noticed a figure, a young woman watching with an uncertain expression. It took a moment to recognize her. "Sarah," James said, surprise in his voice. "Come, meet your sister-in-law." Sarah entered slowly, as if unsure of her welcome. She stopped before Emily, and for a long moment they looked at each other, these two women whose lives were now inextricably intertwined. "I was horrible to you," Sarah finally said, "and I'm sorry. You don't have to forgive me, but I needed to say it." Emily looked at this woman who shared James's eyes and his stubbornness, and saw not an enemy but someone as lost and scared as she herself had been. "We all say things we don't mean when we're hurt," she responded softly. "The question is, what do we do after?" "After," Sarah said with a small smile, "I try to be a better big sister, if you'll let me. I'd like that." And so, in a NICU in New York City, surrounded by babies fighting for life and parents fighting for hope, a family formed, not perfect, not without scars, but real and true and full of possibilities. Families aren't defined by blood or lineage, but by choices, the choice to love, forgive, and show courage together. The following 6 months were a study in adaptation and resilience. Emily spent 2 more weeks in the hospital, recovering from cardiac surgery, while Ethan remained in the NICU, growing stronger each day. Nurses taught her to pump breast milk so he could have her nutrients even when she couldn't hold him. James set up a cot in her room, refusing to leave her alone, sleeping in fragments between visits to Ethan. When both finally got discharged, Emily first, then a week later, Ethan, returning to the apartment was strange. The space that had been their refuge now seemed simultaneously too large and too small. They'd converted James's old office into a nursery, painting it a soft blue that reminded them of a clear sky. The first night home, Ethan cried every 2 hours. Emily, still weak from surgery, tried to nurse him while tears of exhaustion and frustration rolled down her cheeks. "I don't know what I'm doing wrong," she sobbed, when James found her at 3 a.m., both mother and baby crying. "You're not doing anything wrong," he said, gently taking Ethan. "You're new at this, he's new at this. We're all learning together." He walked with Ethan through the apartment, singing off-key lullabies his own mother had sung to him, until the baby finally calmed. By the time he returned to the bedroom, Emily was asleep, sitting up, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle. He lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she was, concerned by the fragility that still persisted, and laid her down properly, covering her with blankets. He stood there for a moment, looking at the woman who had revolutionized his life in less than a year, and marveled at how fate works in mysterious ways. Emily's cardiac physical therapy began 3 weeks after discharge. Twice a week, James drove her to the hospital where she walked on treadmills with monitors attached, where she learned to strengthen her heart without overloading it. It was frustrating. She, who had always been physically capable, now tired after climbing a flight of stairs. "I hate this," she said one afternoon after a particularly difficult session. "I hate being weak." "You're not weak," James responded for the umpteenth time. "You're healing, there's a difference." "Is there? Because from here it feels the same." He stopped in the hospital parking lot, turning to look at her. "Emily, you gave birth prematurely and survived open-heart surgery. Literally open. They had to crack your sternum. And here you are 3 weeks later, walking and complaining and being a mother. If that's not strength, I don't know what is." She looked at him, and slowly, a smile touched her lips. "You know what I like about you?" "What?" "That you don't let me give up, even when I want to. Especially when you want to." Sarah became a regular presence, flying from Boston every 2 weeks to spend time with her half-brother. At first she was awkward around the baby, holding Ethan like he was a grenade, but gradually gained confidence. One afternoon, while Emily napped and James worked from home, Sarah stood watching Ethan in his crib. "Can I ask you something?" she suddenly said. James looked up from his computer. "Sure. Do you really love Emily? It's not just convenience or loneliness or some kind of age crisis?" He closed his laptop, giving her his full attention. "I love her more than I thought I was capable of loving. More even than I loved your mother, though I know that's hard to hear." "No," Sarah said slowly. "Actually, I think I understand now. You and Mom, you were kids when you got married. You grew together, but in different directions. With Emily, it's different. You actively choose her every day." "Exactly. And she chooses you, even when it's hard. Even when it almost killed her." "Yes?" Sarah smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face. "Then I guess the wedding is still on. And I hope you both come. Together." Forgiveness, James was learning, wasn't a one-time event, but an ongoing process. Layers of resentment being slowly peeled away until what remained was understanding. By the 4th month after Ethan's birth, Emily had regained enough strength to start thinking about her future, beyond simply surviving day to day. Her accounting studies had been paused but not abandoned. She began taking online courses during Ethan's naps, determined to finish her degree. "You don't have to do this," James said one night, finding her studying at 11 p.m. while Ethan finally slept. "There's no rush." "There is a rush," she responded, not looking up from her textbook, "because every day I spend not moving toward my goal is a day I lose. And I've already lost enough time this year." "Surviving isn't losing time." "No, but it's not living either. Not completely." He understood. After months of simply existing, hospitals and recovery, and the endless cycle of feeding and diaper changes, she needed to feel she was moving towards something. "Then I'll help you," he said, sitting beside her. "Teach me accounting." She looked at him, surprised. "Really? Really? I can't promise I'll understand it. Numbers were never my strong suit. But I can listen while you study. Sometimes talking out loud helps process." And so it became their routine. After Ethan was asleep, during those stolen hours of the night, Emily taught him accounting while he taught her patience with herself. Sarah's wedding was in August, at an elegant estate in the outskirts of Boston. Emily was nervous. Her body still hadn't completely returned to its pre-pregnancy form, and the surgery scars were visible at certain angles. But James had insisted on buying her a new dress. something that made her feel beautiful. On the wedding day, standing beside James as his daughter exchanged vows, Emily felt overwhelmed by gratitude. She had survived. Ethan was healthy. Sarah had moved from hostility to genuine acceptance. Their broken and reconfigured family was healing. During the reception, Sarah sought out Emily, pulling her away from the table. "Thank you," Sarah said. "For what?" "For making him happy, for giving him a second chance at family, for being strong enough to stay when it would have been easier to leave." Emily felt tears stinging her eyes, a constant phenomenon since the birth, her emotions closer to the surface than ever. "Your father makes me happy too," she responded. "And Ethan is everything. I know. I can see it. The way you look at my little brother, it's the same way Mom used to look at me when I was a baby. Pure, unconditional love. Does it bother you that I'm technically your stepmother?" Sarah laughed. "Honestly, I prefer not to think about the technicalities. I just know you're important to my dad and Ethan is important to me. That's enough. Healing fractured relationships requires time, vulnerability, and the willingness to release narratives that no longer serve us." The real turning point came in the 8th month after Ethan's birth, in the most unexpected way. It was a typical November afternoon in Manhattan, the air laden with the promise of winter, the sky that grey that makes the city seem contemplative. Emily was home with Ethan, who was having a particularly demanding day, crying every time she put him in his crib. Then the phone rang. An unknown number. "Hello?" she answered, balancing the phone between ear and shoulder while rocking Ethan. "Miss Carter, this is NYU calling. It's about your readmission application." Emily's heart leaped. She'd sent the application weeks ago, hopeful, but not optimistic. American universities weren't known for their flexibility with students in unusual circumstances. "Yes, speaking. I'm pleased to inform you that your application has been approved. You can rejoin next semester. Additionally, given your documented medical situation and your excellent previous grades, you qualify for a hardship scholarship that will cover your full tuition." Emily had to sit down. What? Really?" "Completely serious. We'll need you to come to the registrar's office next week to finalize paperwork." After hanging up, Emily sat staring at the phone, barely able to process what she'd just heard. It was real. It was happening. She could continue her education, work toward her dream of having her own firm. When James came home that night, she met him at the door with a smile so wide her face hurt. "What happened?" he asked, immediately alert. In the last year, he'd learned that big news could be good or devastating. "I got readmitted with a full scholarship." The expression of joy on his face was everything she needed. He lifted her, still careful of her healing chest, and spun her while she laughed. "I'm so proud of you," he said, setting her down but not releasing her. So incredibly proud. But that night, when Ethan was asleep and they had privacy to really talk, reality began to settle in. "How are we going to make this work?" Emily asked. "I can't take Ethan to classes, and I don't want to leave him with strangers all day." "Then you won't," James said. "I've been thinking, what if I restructure my work? Do more work from home? Hire someone to handle on-site meetings? I can be primary caregiver while you're in class. James, you can't just reorganize your entire business for me. I'm not doing it just for you. I'm doing it for us, for our family." "And honestly," he admitted, "I missed Sarah's childhood because I was obsessed with building the business. I don't want to miss Ethan's too." "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." The first day back to classes was terrifying. Emily had organized her schedule to take courses only 2 days a week, intensive blocks that maximized her time on campus while minimizing time away from Ethan. Still, when she said goodbye that first morning with Ethan in James's arms, she had to force herself to walk out the door. "We'll be fine," James called after her. "We'll be perfectly fine." And they were. When she returned that afternoon, she found James on the living room floor, Ethan on his chest, both napping while a football game played silently on the TV. The scene stopped her in her tracks. This man, this successful businessman who'd commanded dozens of employees and million-dollar projects, was sleeping with his son drooling slightly on his expensive shirt and had never looked happier. True strength is not doing everything alone, but allowing others to share our burdens and celebrate our victories. The following months found their rhythm. Emily attended classes, studied during Ethan's naps, occasionally brought her son to campus where other students melted at his smile. James discovered he enjoyed fatherhood in ways he'd never anticipated. Days structured around feeding schedules and naps, small victories of new milestones, the intimacy of daily care. Sarah visited more frequently now, sometimes staying entire weekends. One afternoon, while Emily studied for finals and James was on a video conference, Sarah held Ethan on the balcony. "You know what's funny?" she said when Emily came out for a break. "What?" "I spent so much time angry at Dad for breaking up our family, but looking at him now, the way he looks at you, the way he is with Ethan, I realized something. He didn't break up our family. He just made space for a different one. And both can exist, both can be real." Emily felt emotion tightening her throat. "That means a lot coming from you." "It means I'm growing up," Sarah responded with a smile. Finally, the climax of Emily's transformation came on her final exam in advanced accounting, the hardest course in her program, the one she'd been putting off because it scared her. She sat in the exam room, surrounded by students 10 years younger with no children or heart surgeries in their recent history, and for a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm her. Then she thought of Ethan, of James, of all the times she'd wanted to give up but hadn't, of the silent promise she'd made to herself in that hospital bed, to survive, not just to survive, but to really live. She answered each question with confidence born of nights of study and determination forged in fire. When she turned in her exam, her hands were steady. A week later, results were posted. A+. She called James immediately, her voice trembling with emotion. "I did it." "Oh my God, James, I did it." "I never doubted you would," he responded, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Are you coming home? We need to celebrate." "I'm on my way." But before going home, Emily made one stop. The cemetery where her parents were buried was on the outskirts of the city, a quiet place with cypress trees and the distant sound of church bells. She knelt before their headstones, placing fresh flowers she'd bought on the way. "Hi, Mom." "Dad?" she began, feeling foolish but needing to speak anyway. "I know you've been dead for 6 years. I know you probably can't hear me. But just in case, I want you to know I'm okay. More than okay. I have a family now. A son. A man who loves me, even when I'm difficult. And I'm finishing my degree like I promised I would." Tears rolled, but they were clean, purgative. "I almost died this year. Almost saw you again. But someone, brought me back. And now I understand that I didn't survive just for myself. I survived for all the days you didn't have, for every moment you missed. I'm living them in your name." The wind whispered through the cypress trees, and for a moment, just a moment, Emily could have sworn she felt a hand on her shoulder, warm, comforting, real. "Thank you for giving me life," she whispered. "I promise not to waste it." The dead don't leave us instructions on how to live, only the example of their own lives and the hope that we make ours meaningful. 12 months after the day Emily slipped on wet stairs, 18 months after meeting James, 3 months after Ethan celebrated his first birthday, they got married. It wasn't the grand wedding James could have easily paid for. It wasn't in an impressive church or historic mansion. It was at a small estate rented in the Hudson Valley, surrounded by century-old oak trees that had witnessed generations of loves and losses. The ceremony was at sunset, when the light turned everything golden. There were 30 guests, Aunt Margaret, who cried through the entire ceremony, Sarah and her husband Philip, a few close friends from both, and of course Ethan, who in his little suit looked like a tiny gentleman. Emily wore a simple cream-colored dress that flowed around her like water. There was no veil, no dramatic train, just her, with a crown of wildflowers in her hair and a smile that seemed too big for her face. James waited under an arch of oak branches intertwined with white roses. When he saw her walking toward him, not given away by anyone because she was no longer someone's property to give, but walking by her own choice, he thought his heart might burst. The vows they exchanged weren't traditional. They'd written them themselves sitting on their balcony late at night, Ethan sleeping in his crib, New York flickering below them. James spoke first, his voice steady but emotional. "Emily, when I met you, I was convinced my life was already written, that the remaining pages would just be repetition of the previous ones. Work, loneliness, the resignation of someone who'd lost their chance at true happiness. But then you slipped on those stairs and I caught you. And unknowingly you caught me too. You taught me that life isn't something that happens to us, but something we actively create, every day, with every choice. You taught me that true love isn't security or control, but the willingness to be vulnerable, to let go, to trust. I promise to walk beside you, not ahead of you or behind, but next to you. I promise to listen when you speak and be silent when you need quiet. I promise to celebrate your successes as if they were mine and support you in your struggles as if they were ours. And I promise every day to choose you again, not from obligation or habit, but because you are my happiest choice. Emily fought tears as she spoke, her voice trembling slightly. James, I was so afraid to love you. Afraid I was too young, too inexperienced, too ordinary for someone extraordinary. But you taught me that love isn't about being perfect, or even about being equal. It's about being authentic. It's about showing ourselves completely, our fears, our scars, our moments of weakness, and trusting the other person will see us and choose us anyway. This year almost took you from me, almost took me from myself, but we survived, together, and every scar I carry is evidence that love is worth fighting for. I promise to be your partner in all ways. I promise to challenge you when you need to be challenged and comfort you when you need comfort. I promise to build a life with you where Ethan, and any other children we have, grows up knowing that love is strong and gentle, passionate but patient, imperfect but real. And I promise for the rest of my days to love you not despite our differences, but because of them. There was no priest, just a justice of the peace who'd agreed to officiate the ceremony. He declared their marriage with simple words that somehow contained all the weight of the world. By the power vested in me by the state of New York, I pronounce you husband and wife. The kiss was tender, sweet, loaded with everything they'd survived together. Guests applauded. Ethan cried, perfectly timed, and the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of pink and purple that seemed impossible. The reception was in the estate's courtyard, under string lights that glowed like captured stars. They ate grilled steaks cooked on a huge grill over open fire, drank champagne that bubbled and laughed in their glasses, danced to the sound of a local guitarist who knew songs that had been sung on these lands for generations. At one point while dancing, James guiding Emily through improvised waltz steps while guests toasted and laughed around them, he leaned to whisper in her ear, "Are you happy?" She pulled back enough to look at him, this man who'd become her anchor and her wing simultaneously, and smiled. "I'm complete." Later, when guests had left and Ethan slept in his carrier, the newlyweds sat alone in the estate garden. The air smelled of jasmine and warm earth. Above, the stars were so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "You know what I was thinking," Emily said, her head resting on James's shoulder. "What?" "That a year ago, I was in a hospital bed, terrified I'd never see another day. And now I'm here, married with a beautiful baby, finishing my degree. It's almost too good to be real." "It's real," James assured, kissing the top of her head. "We fought hard enough for it to be real. Do you think it'll always be like this?" "Happy?" "No," he answered honestly. "There'll be hard days, arguments, moments where we question our choices. But we'll have this moment, this love, to remind us why we chose to stay." Emily nodded, knowing he was right. Life wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real, complicated, imperfect, and precisely because of that, beautiful. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too, always." And there, under the infinite American sky, surrounded by oak trees that had seen countless generations of lovers come and go, Emily and James shared a kiss that tasted of kept promises and futures yet to be written. The next day, they'd drive back to New York. They'd return to their routines, Emily to her classes, James to his work, both to the endless demands of parenthood. There would be sleepless nights when Ethan was teething, arguments about finances and responsibilities, visits from in-laws and relatives with their own opinions about how they should live their lives. But now, in this moment suspended between past and future, there existed only the two of them, and the certainty that whatever happened, they'd face everything together. Sarah appeared at the garden threshold, carrying sleeping Ethan. "Thought you might want a family photo," she said softly, pulling out her phone. Emily and James stood taking their son between them. Sarah framed the shot. 3 generations connected by chosen love, not forced, by forgiveness earned through effort, by the understanding that families aren't perfect but constantly evolving. "Smile," Sarah instructed, and they did. Genuine smiles that reached their eyes and spoke of real joy, not manufactured. The flash captured the moment. James with his arm around Emily, who held Ethan, all three illuminated by string lights and moon, and something less tangible but equally real, the glow of people who'd found their way to each other against all odds. That night, after Sarah left and Ethan was safely sleeping in his portable crib, Emily and James lay together as husband and wife for the first time. It wasn't different from all the other nights they'd shared, and yet it was fundamentally transformed. These same hands now carried rings, these same hearts now united not just by love, but by promises made before witnesses. "Do you remember the first night?" Emily murmured in the darkness. "When you said, 'I've got you,' I remember. I thought it meant you'd protect me, that you'd keep me safe from the world. And now? Now I know it meant you'd be there, in the good times and the impossible ones, that we'd take care of each other." James pulled her closer, feeling the steady beat of her repaired heart against his chest. "Wise observation, Mrs. Morrison." She smiled against his neck. "Mrs. Morrison. Still sounds strange. You'll get used to it. I hope I never get used to it. I hope it always feels a little magical." And with that hope whispered in darkness, with their son breathing softly in the next room, and their futures unfolding before them like a path leading somewhere beautiful and uncertain, they fell asleep. Outside, the American night continued its ancient dance. Owls hunting in oak groves, wind murmuring secrets across fields, stars silently witnessing the small human dramas unfolding beneath them. True love is not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new one. A path consciously chosen, courageously walked, and maintained through the daily choice to show up, stay, and love unconditionally. Months later, when Emily would graduate from college with honors, when James would launch a new branch of his company specialized in affordable housing, when Ethan would say his first word, "Mama," to Emily's delight and James's slight disappointment, when Sarah would announce she was pregnant, making them aunt and uncle, when life would continue unfolding with its predictable and unpredictable joys, they'd always look back to this day, this perfect moment in an oak garden, and remember where they began. And in a small estate in the Hudson Valley, a family slept, not perfect, not without scars, but complete in all the ways that mattered, from wet stares and impossible attractions, from confronted fears and embraced vulnerabilities, from a promise whispered in darkness, "I've got you," and how that simple promise had become the foundation upon which they built an entire life, not despite the challenges they faced, but because of them. Because in the end, the best love stories aren't about perfection. They're about two imperfect people who refuse to give up on each other, who choose to show up day after day, who transform their wounds into wisdom and their struggles into strength. They're about finding home not in a place but in a person, and allowing that person to find you too. And that, Emily and James decided, as they danced under American stars with their son sleeping nearby, and all their future shining before them, was the most beautiful story of all.